Penalties. Preparer penalties, understatement of taxpayers' liability. Internal Revenue Code Section 6694A, understatement due to unreasonable positions. The penalty is the greater of $1,000 or 50% of the income derived by the tax return preparer with respect to the return or claim for refund. A position is considered unreasonable if there was not substantial authority for the position and the position was not disclosed. The position was disclosed, but there was not reasonable basis for the position. Internal Revenue Code Section 6694B, understatement due to willful or reckless conduct. The penalty is the greater of $5,000 or 75% of the income derived by the tax return preparer with respect to the return or claim for refund. Willful or reckless conduct is more fully defined as a willful attempt in any manner to understate the tax liability by the preparer, or the preparer has recklessly or intentionally disregarded rules or regulations. Failure to furnish a copy to taxpayer. Failure to sign return. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695A, failure to furnish copy to taxpayer. The penalty is $50 for each failure to comply with Internal Revenue Code Section 6107, which is in regards to furnishing a copy of a return or claim to a taxpayer. The maximum penalty imposed on any tax return preparer shall not exceed $26,000 in any calendar year. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695B, failure to sign return. The penalty is $50 for each failure to sign a return or claim for refund as required. The maximum penalty imposed on any tax return preparer shall not exceed $26,000 in a calendar year. Failure to furnish identifying number, retain a copy of a return, and failure to file correct information returns. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695C, failure to furnish identifying number. The penalty is $50 for each failure to comply with Internal Revenue Code Section 6109A4 regarding furnishing an identifying number on a return or claim. The maximum penalty imposed on any tax return preparer shall not exceed $26,000 in a calendar year. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695D, failure to retain, copy, or list. The penalty is $50 for each failure to comply with Internal Revenue Code Section 6107B regarding retaining a copy or list of a return or claim. The maximum penalty imposed on any tax return preparer shall not exceed $26,000 in any return period. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695E, failure to file correct information returns. The penalty is $50 for each failure to comply with Internal Revenue Code Section 6060. The maximum penalty imposed on any tax return preparer shall not exceed $26,000 in a return period. Negotiation of check. Due diligence penalties. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695F, negotiation of check. The penalty is $520 for a tax return preparer who endorses or negotiates any check made in respect of taxes imposed by Title 26, which are federal taxes. Any checks issued to a taxpayer. Internal Revenue Code Section 6695G. Failure to be diligent in determining eligibility for child tax credit, American Opportunity Tax Credit, Earned Income Credit, credit for other dependents, and head of household filing status. The penalty is $520 for each failure to comply with the due diligence requirements imposed in the regulations. Preparers must keep all 5 of the following records for 3 years. A copy of Form 8867, the applicable worksheets and their own worksheets for any credits claimed, copies of any taxpayer documents that may have been relied upon to determine eligibility for the credits or head of household filing status, a record of how, when, and from whom the information used to prepare Form 8867 and the applicable worksheets was obtained, a record of any additional questions that were asked regarding eligibility for the credit, the amount of the credit, the and/or eligibility for head of household filing status, and the taxpayer's answers. Failure to meet the due diligence requirements for claiming the Earned Income Credit, the Child Tax Credit, American Opportunity Tax Credit, the Other Dependent Credit, head of household filing status could result in a penalty of $520 for each failure. For example, if a preparer is paid to prepare a return claiming the Earned Income Credit, Child Tax Credit, the Additional Child Tax Credit, the Other Dependent Credit, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, or head of household filing status, and they fail to meet the due diligence requirements, they could be subject to a penalty up to $2,080. So for each of the credits or the filing status, the $520 applies. Aiding and abetting understatement, fraud, and false statements. Internal Revenue Code Section 6701. Penalties for aiding and abetting understatement of tax liability. The penalty is $1,000, $10,000 if the conduct relates to a corporation's tax returns, for aiding and abetting in an understatement of a tax liability. Any person subject to the penalty shall be penalized only once for documents relating to the same taxpayer for a single tax period or event. Internal Revenue Code Section 7206, fraud and false statements. Guilty of a felony, and upon conviction, a fine of not more than $100,000, $500,000 in the case of a corporation. Imprisonment of not more than 3 years, or both, together with the cost of prosecution. Disclosure or use of information by preparers, both civil and criminal. Internal Revenue Code Section 6713. Disclosure or use of information by preparers of returns. The penalty is $250 for each unauthorized disclosure or use of information furnished for or in connection with the preparation of a return. The maximum penalty on any person shall not exceed $10,000 in a calendar year. That's the civil penalty. Now, the criminal penalty. Internal Revenue Code Section 7216 is a criminal provision enacted by the U.S. Congress in 1971 that prohibits preparers of tax returns from knowingly or recklessly disclosing or using tax return information. A convicted preparer may be fined not more than $1,000 or imprisoned not more than 1 year or both for each violation. Action to enjoin. Internal Revenue Code Section 7407, Action to enjoin tax return preparers. A federal district court may enjoin a tax return preparer from engaging in certain proscribed conduct, or in extreme cases, from continuing to act as a tax return preparer altogether. Common taxpayer penalties. Failure to file. Internal Revenue Code Section 6651A1. 5% of unpaid tax required to be reported. This is reduced by the failure to pay penalty amount for any month where both apply. Penalty is charged each month or part of a month the return is late, up to 5 months. Applies for a full month, even if the return is filed less than 30 days late. Income tax returns are subject to a minimum late penalty when filed more than 60 days after the return due date, including extensions. The minimum penalty is the lesser of two amounts: 100% of the tax required to be shown on the return that wasn't paid on time, or a specific dollar amount that is adjusted annually for inflation. The specific dollar amounts are $215 for returns due on or after January 1st of 2020, $210 for returns due between January 1 of 2018 and December 31, 2019. So that's sort of our current amount as this recording is being made, $210. There are lesser amounts for returns filed before January 1, 2018. Next, failure to pay tax reported on return. Internal Revenue Code Section 6651A2. 0.5% of tax not paid by due date, which is April 15th. 0.25% during an approved installment agreement, if the return was filed on time and the taxpayer is an individual, or 1% if tax is not paid within 10 days of a notice of intent to levy. This is a recurring charge on the remaining unpaid tax each month or part of a month following the due date until the tax is fully paid or until 25% is reached. Full monthly charge applies even if the tax is paid before the month ends. Failure to pay tax not reported on original return and not paid. Let me start that over. Next, failure to pay tax not reported on original return and not paid in full within 21 days of the date of notice and demand. 10 business days if the amount in the notice and demand equals or exceeds $100,000. This is Internal Revenue Code Section 6651A3. So this is a new amount, and this is for failure to pay tax that was not reported on the original return. The failure to pay penalty that we discussed immediately before this was for failure to pay tax reported on a return. This penalty is 0.5% of tax not paid by due date in the notice, generally 21 calendar days from notice date. 10 business days if the balance equals or exceeds $100,000. 0.25% during an approved installment agreement. 1% if tax not paid within 10 days of a notice of intent to levy. This is a recurring charge on the remaining unpaid tax each month or part of a month following the due date until the tax is fully paid. Full monthly charge applies even if the tax is paid before the month ends. Next penalty. Failure to pay proper estimated tax. Internal Revenue Code Section 6654. Estimated tax payments are generally required if the taxpayer expects to owe at least $1,000 in tax after subtracting withholding and refundable credits. Generally calculated on Form 2210. And our final penalty that we're going to look at for preparers in this particular slide. Dishonored checks or other form of payment. Internal Revenue Code Section 6657. For payments of $1,250 or more, the penalty is 2% of the amount of the payment. For payments less than $1,250, the penalty is the amount of the payment or $25, whichever is less. Taxpayer penalties that are eligible for relief. Penalties eligible for penalty relief include failing to file a tax return, failing to pay on time, failing to deposit certain taxes as required, and other penalties as applicable. The following type of penalty relief are offered by the IRS. Reasonable cause, administrative waiver and first-time penalty abatement, a statutory exception. If the IRS doesn't abate interest for reasonable cause or as first-time relief, or I should say, the IRS does not abate interest for reasonable cause or as first-time relief. Interest is charged by law and will continue until the account is fully paid. If any of the penalties are reduced, that will automatically reduce the related interest. However, IRS can abate interest charged on underpayment of tax in certain cases if the cause relates to IRS actions. Again, IRS can abate interest charged on underpayment of tax in certain cases if the cause relates to IRS actions. Let's look at two questions. Willie is the owner of an accounting firm. One of his employees prepares an income tax return for a client and opinionates or opines that a deduction can be claimed for a bad debt. If the return is examined and the deduction is disallowed, Willie will not be subject to a preparer penalty under which of these circumstances? There is a reasonable basis for the position and the position is disclosed. Well, that's okay. That's acceptable. That gives them an ability to avoid the penalty, where there's a reasonable basis on the return and that was disclosed. Next, there is substantial authority. However, the position was not disclosed. Well, when there's substantial authority, the position does not need to be disclosed. So that is an acceptable situation also. So our answer is both A and B. Both of these qualify the avoidance or qualify for the avoidance of a preparer penalty. Reasonable basis that was disclosed. Also, substantial authority, even if it's not disclosed. Both A and B are fine. Next and final. The IRS may assess 20% penalties on both IRC Section 6662B1, 6662B1, negligence or disregard of rules, or IRC Section 66B2, substantial underpayment. Considering both penalties being charged, what is the maximum penalty? Well, these are each 20% penalties. 6662B1, 20% penalty. 6662B2, 20% penalty. However, the IRS may assess both of these penalties, but the total penalty cannot exceed 20%. In other words, the penalties are not stackable. So the answer is 20% for both, because we can't stack this 20% on top of this 20%. They're not stackable, so maximum is 20%, and that would be our answer B. Okay, hope you found this interesting. Hope you found it informative as you study for the enrolled agent exam.